everyone, and welcome to our podcast, Clear as Mud, where we talk to game developers from all walks of life about their personal and professional journeys. I'm your host, Graham Waldrop. As always, our show is presented by Mudstack, the only asset management and collaboration tool custom built for game studios and digital artists. For more information, head over to mudstack.com. On today's show, we welcome Aaron Hamilton Cook, producer at Bioware. Aaron takes us through how he works with the team and touches on the core events that shaped him as a producer. We then walk through a hypothetical game that I pitch Aaron, and he delves deep into how, as a producer, he would make that game become a reality. If you've been a listener for a while, you know that production is in my background, so whenever we have a producer on, we tend to just get in the weeds a little bit more than maybe I would with, an artist or an engineer. Prepare yourself for that a little bit, but this is really fun. And I think you're really going to like what Aaron has to say and learn a heck of a lot about the production discipline. So let's jump straight into our conversation with Aaron. When a producer comes in and sort of forces their will upon a team without taking into consideration the skills or the experience or really thinking about what the product is, they already have their way of doing things. It sort of creates this square peg, round hole effect. It can be really detrimental to a team and the way that they work, and it can really affect morale, and then your project gets off on a really, really bad start.
Yeah, I think the way I've seen that manifest most frequently is I need you all team members to do things this specific way so that it generates my report that has all the numbers and data and looks the right way. There's some reports that are necessary that you're going to have some level of that with, but if it's not going to executives, if it's not going to directors, if it's not something that other people really need to be informed to make proper decisions, then you're really sort of just slowing things down for the sake of having something that either makes you feel good or feel like you look good. I feel like that can be a very ego-driven sort of exercise.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the interesting things is that I would imagine a lot of people think a producer could have a big ego, but that's actually like the one position. I think everybody needs to be pretty egoless on a team, but I feel like especially at a production level, when you're keeping track of everybody and keeping things moving, you really, really can't worry about yourself as much as the team. Because if you do, then you're really going to set the whole team behind. I think the idea of like generating a good report over getting good results is like insane to me.
Yeah, I was fortunate to sort of cut my teeth in an environment where I was reporting to our VP of game dev, and he was very much like, nope, this is a meritocracy. What matters is what you and the team get done and accomplish. I don't care how good our numbers look. I don't care how good our data looks. Like, I care that we're actually getting content out the door that performs well.
Yeah, because I've been in a position where, it was like, we were really behind on sprints and or we're doing too much or whatever. And it was like, there's so much emphasis on just trying to make those reports better as opposed to like, well, what are we actually producing? Totally agree. Totally agree on that. And so what is your process like for keeping track of different departments? Are you like right now, are you kind of overseeing, the entire project, or are you focusing on a specific discipline, or how does that work?
Yeah, I'm cross-discipline in terms of what I oversee. I'm over one pillar, but I'm not the sole producer on that pillar. Mm-hmm. I have a number of teams that I directly oversee. We've got an assistant producer on that I delegate tasks to and help him develop his career and his skills. And we have conversations around the things that I feel are important, and he raises some great points. And it's a whole swath of overseeing technical design, programming, like working with animation and animators, working with combat designers, working with level design. It's full gamut of disciplines.
So when you're kind of thinking about that from a pipeline standpoint, you're working with team leads and your other producers. What's that like in terms of setting that up and making sure like, okay, we have a process? And then how adaptive are you going through iterations and things like that in terms of changing that process if need be to sort of better fit the team?
Yeah, I mean, when I'm looking at process, I'm looking at who needs what information when, and trying to figure that out. Like, hey, we're gonna we'll use doors as an example. Doors are in a lot of games. They're always difficult. They're always a challenge. So there's conversations with animation around what do you need to know so that we can animate the character correctly as they interact with the door? What do you need to know so that we can animate the door correctly? Hey, tech design, what do you need to know? When do you need to know it around how we set up our our visual scripting and our standards, whether or not this data is persistent, or what sort of performance concerns do we have around doors, and working with programming and performance teams, working with art to establish the direction around what these doors are and the story that tells, because you've got a door that's pristine and polished versus one that's gritty and grimy, like that's a different sort of narrative beat that you're sort of implying in the environment. So there's a lot of, it's just figuring out like who needs to know what information, when do they need to know it, and then figuring out how to daisy chain that in as effective a way as possible so that people feel supported, they feel like they have what they need, they feel like they know the person on either side of them, that they can communicate ahead of time and say, I'm going to need this, or please make sure you include this. And they're going to be able to communicate with the person after them in the chain and say, hey, here's what I'm doing. Like, does that work for you? And then when it comes to adaptability, I typically propose rather than straight up implement changes in process. So I will go to the team and I'll say, perfect example, a couple companies ago, we were working on a project and we were doing story points one way, where we were using Fibonacci, in a very agile sort of environment, and it just wasn't working for one of the team members. They just couldn't grok Fibonacci. It just wasn't registering for them. And so I was like, okay, let's do this. I know that like on paper, agile is supposed to be story points are a measure of effort, not a measure of time, but nobody thinks that way on this team. So let's make 1 point half a day. If you have a task that takes more than 10 points, then we should talk about how we can break that task up. And there were some people that raised some concerns, and we worked through that stuff and adapted things a little bit, but it made it a lot easier on the team when we moved away from that, so that we didn't have, everybody's expecting Fibonacci to look one way, and then there's somebody who is entering like a 12-point estimate when that's not
right.
The Fibonacci scale. Yeah.
Yeah. And it sort of gets to a point, right, where you realize, okay, it's gone on long enough. This really isn't working. Like we got to change something. I also find though that, when you do make a change though, then you got to be like, then you got to sort of start the evaluation process over and think about, is this working now? How are we measuring the results?
Yeah. I have found that like I've made changes that have just been absolutely bad calls, and 3 weeks in,
yeah.
Like there's some amount of like, I know it's going to be rough, but let's stick with it. And then there's times where you're like, no, this was a bad decision. Let's go back. Yeah. I'm sorry. That was a bad choice for me. You got to be self-aware and humble in those moments, and just be honest with the team that like, hey, I messed up. Let's go back to the other thing, because I think that was working better for us.
Yeah. Especially in different stages of development, right? I think I always find that it's tough to kind of measure velocity when you're in kind of like the pre-production phase versus the production phase. I feel like things kind of have to change a little bit because the capacity could potentially increase for specific tasks and things like that. What do you do to sort of navigate the different stages of development and how you're setting up story point estimates and things like that, and tracking all that?
Yeah, I mean, I prefer, if we can, estimates versus actuals, and I prefer time over story points. I find that, at least in my limited experience, Agile is a really good tool for a product that exists. So it might be good for like an MMO where you're in live ops.
Yeah.
I have found it to be a less than ideal solution for developing a new product. And so I tend to, if I can, I try to gravitate more towards almost a waterfall setup, but understanding that like we're not going to go to the level of doing a BSD or WBSD, a work breakdown structure dictionary, where we've got 97% of all of the tasks developed and allocated and a perfect timeline planned out. Like we need to have some level of flexibility around iterating on things and changing design direction, right? Like when we're making a game, we're trying to develop fun. Like what is fun? So you need to be a little bit flexible about how you approach things, because you might go down one path and realize like, the way we're doing mobility feels like a slog. It doesn't feel fun, or it feels too loose and a little bit too slidey. So we need to improve the way we're doing traversal. Like making every single aspect of a game is to be fun is really hard.
Well, I think that's interesting too, because I know like waterfall can be perceived as a bad word in development, but I think, sort of adhering too much to one sort of methodology can be dangerous. If you're strictly agile, you're strictly waterfall. I kind of like sort of like a hybrid methodology, which it sounds like that's sort of what you try to employ as well.
Yeah, I think it's important when you're looking at all these different methodologies that you're really understanding that they're a theory that can be applied in practical application, right? So you need to understand why this theory exists, what it serves to accomplish, what it serves to do for you, for the team, for the product, for the project. And I really prefer to, like, once I have that understanding, piecemeal together the best solution from the available options.
Yeah. I found out the hard way when it was just like, we're doing strictly agile, and then it just didn't work at all. I was like, okay, well, maybe I need to like learn more about waterfall and other things and just try to see what works and what doesn't. And like something that works well for one team might not work well at all for another. I find that it's interesting that you like to do time. How do you measure time? Is that in hours?
I do days, and I go down to half days.
Okay.
As far as like how granular I like to get, just because, I'm working on a scale of projects that take years usually. I think the shortest project I've ever worked on was like 6 months, right? So like even then it's still granular enough from my perspective. And I like to try and balance scope and capacity. So you have scope of work, I think is pretty straightforward. This is the amount of work that we've sort of estimated and figured out, and we think this is how long all this will take. And then for capacity, I go through and try to look at each individual and what their capacity is. I assume leads are not going to contribute, that they're going to be in meetings, that they're going to be more or less information brokers. And then, team members need to use the bathroom. They're going to lose time to meetings. They're going to need to grab lunch, stuff like that. So I think my baseline is like folks are usually at 80 to 70% capacity, depending upon how diligent they are, how hard they work, their level of involvement in decision-making and in consultation and stuff like that. And then it goes lower as they get more involved in different types of things. A principal engineer is going to do a lot more consulting. So they might be at 50% capacity, but their ability to deliver is different than a junior at 70%, right? So
right.
There's a certain amount of balancing there to be made, that like once a task goes to an individual, maybe re-estimating to make sure that we've got things sort of set the right way. That's how I tend to approach it, because then it becomes very black and white. Like we have more scope than we have capacity. Like we can't do all this without crunching the team, so we need to figure out solutions now. Or we have on paper more capacity than we do scope. We should be in a good position. Let's just keep an eye on it to make sure we're not wrong.
And how do you balance out meetings? I've always found that to be such a problem, that there are all these meetings to talk about all this stuff, and then there's not enough time to do the work, and that obviously eats into capacity. So how do you balance out meetings, particularly with the people that are getting their hands dirty, not necessarily the leads?
Yeah, I think there's a few things you can do to improve things there. Every meeting should have an agenda, and that needs to be in the invite. It needs to be iterated at the start of the meeting, and like communicated that like this is what we're here for, so that you can stay focused, stay on topic, and if you can, try to end early. There's no reason to stick. Like if we've booked 30 minutes, but we've covered everything we need to in 10, let's wrap up now so that people can get back to it. Right? There's no need.
That sounds like the best meeting in the world, right there.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had several of those. They're always really satisfying. I think that's where you start. And then it becomes sort of a tactical decision around understanding who needs to be in the room, right? For consulting, for decision making, for gathering and relaying information, and whittling it down to just those essential folks. So if I'm attending a meeting, I can do the note taking and send out, hey, this was the decision that we made. This is the things that were discussed. Here's why we're going this direction. I don't need an IC there to gather information so that they're aware as to what we're going to move on. They just need to know when that they should be getting that information so that they're not, moving ahead too quickly. If somebody's there to consult, then they need to understand that like they're not part of the decision process, that they should just be informing people as to the risks and concerns and the various rat's nests of code and different types of things that you might end up with if you go down that particular direction. Like, hey, just so you know, this could be a problem, and here's why. And I think there's a difference between finding a solution and identifying a problem, making sure that you can, hey, you know what, that is a problem. We're going to discuss that offline to figure out how we solution that. So, I mean, when we've got tools like Slack and email and stuff like that, it's really easy to take some of these conversations offline and have asynchronous collaboration to find solutions.
At least for me, with the sort of the asynchronous stuff, I find that works better, especially when you have kind of that team dynamic built out and everybody feels good working with each other. I always get concerned when I'm doing something like that with a team I don't know well yet. I don't know. It's just one of those things where it's just like I like to make sure we're all on the same page, and I feel like sometimes things can get lost in communication with Slack or email or any other sort of form of communication like that. You feel similarly about that, or are you kind of more hands off, I guess, in that respect?
Yeah, I do see that occur on occasion. When it is obvious that there's a sort of a misalignment in communication, that like one person is seeing things one way, somebody's saying things another way, I'll sort of just ask probing questions. Like, hey, yeah, I understand we want to tackle things in this way. Is that because we have this concern? And then they'll correct me and be like, no, we need to do it this way for this reason. Oh, okay. And this is a problem why, and like just trying to, because I'm a producer, I'm not the technical person. I can ask the dumb questions and nobody will bat an eye. But if you're a programmer and you're talking to a tech designer, you might feel self-conscious about asking some sort of technical thing that like you're supposed to know, right? And so I find that that's one way that I can serve the team well, is just jumping in and asking what other people would view as dumb questions, because nobody's going to expect the producer to ever know any of this stuff.
Yeah. So there are a couple of things you said there I really liked, especially with having an agenda for the meeting. Don't just have people show up and be like, well, what are we talking about? And then you got to spend 10 minutes figuring that out. Have the appropriate people there. I've always found also, like, when you're reviewing sort of design documents or concepts, or whatever, even for like a prototype, if like there's a way to get that out before the meeting so everyone can have their thoughts ready going into the meeting, then that saves a heck of a lot of time too.
Yeah, or another thing that I found is very successful is having delegates. So like, hey, we can't have this review without this critical stakeholder. It's like, well, let's reach out to that critical stakeholder and see, like, is there somebody you trust to make this decision on your behalf? And having that person show up instead, so that people have a little bit more freedom to focus on higher level things if they can't make it to reviews and stuff.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we were talking about before we started recording, which I definitely want to touch on, is you've been doing this for a minute here. So what are some things that have changed about your approach from when you started to where you are now, and maybe what events have occurred that sort of influence that change?
So when I first entered the discipline of production, I thought I need to be the person with the answers. And I need to be the person who makes decisions, and I need to frame things in a way that makes me look good so the team feels confident in me. And those are bad things, by the way. Those are not ways to be an effective producer.
Yeah.
So I learned to let go of like being the person that the team believes in, because I withheld that we moved a date and the team got everything done early. And then I come in, I'm like, hey, we have 2 extra weeks. So if you want to polish that up, like, you've got some extra time. Like, I learned that that's sort of abusive from somebody else that I was working with, who was coaching and mentoring me at the time, and jumped in and gave some information about how some dates had moved. And I was like, wait, what? But why would we do that? Like, now they're going to take the extra time. And he, explained to me, like, well, it's important that they know what the reality is, so that we're not providing undue pressure on the team. Like, it's not to say that we don't want to put pressure on the team, but we don't want to put unnecessary pressure on the team, right? And there's a difference between like pressure and I don't know how you would frame what the antithesis would be, like what the sort of toxic version of pressure is. Maybe it'd be better to say there's a difference between creating a tense and intense environment, right? Like, you can have pressure in an intense environment, but in a tense environment, it's just creating like conflict. And then learning that I don't have to be the one with the answers came down to like how often I didn't have the answers and just, okay, well, let me go find out. And then figuring out that really I just need to make sure that the team gets the answers they need. It doesn't have to come from me. I don't have to have them ahead of time. There was one project I was on where I felt I had to be the one to make the decision as to whether or not we went with some sort of technical solution. And I made a bad call. There were a lot of VPs and the like in that meeting, and I had learned after the fact that there's nothing wrong with saying, you know what, I hear like this is great information. Let me take this back to the team and consult with them and figure out what the best solution is. Right? Like that'll take me 5 minutes after this meeting to get that answer. That should be no big deal. Yeah, there's a level of self-awareness you sort of have to have in this industry so that you can continue to grow and develop. Otherwise, you're just going to keep making the same mistakes.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It's like, it is kind of crazy when you're like, oh man, I really don't know. And then I've actually had the same thing happen before to me, where someone's sort of coming to me for like, well, we need this, and like, when can we have it? And you feel like, oh, I just got to be able to tell them when we can have it. Like, I'll talk to the team later. Like, I should know. And then you just put everybody behind the 8 ball when you do something like that.
Yeah, totally.
So, we can't really get too much in the weeds on what you're working on now, but I think what we've been doing is sort of having people come on from different disciplines and talking about like if we were to make a hypothetical game, if we're starting out with prototypes, how are you approaching this? How are we approaching this game? So it's sort of like, if I were to pitch you an idea for a game, you could tell me, okay, this is, and I can say like, this is the team size, this is the, this is the style of the game. We can sort of start to do a little exercise in terms of how we would plan this game out. One game that I've always wanted to make that I've never been able to. So it's a game very much like in the style of Flower. If you're familiar with Flower.
Yeah, I love. Yeah. Is that game company?
Yeah, that game company.
Yeah.
But it's kind of similar in that you play as a turtle. It's like a baby turtle. Mm-hmm. You're born. You crawl out of the egg onto the beach. You have to get into the water. There are predators out there. There are, seagulls, pelicans, crabs, etc. You got to get into the ocean, and it's sort of like this mad, frenetic dash into the ocean. And then once you get in there, it's sort of this life, and then subsequently the death of this turtle, and you sort of follow it throughout its life, and you're just going through the ocean, and you're having to deal with predators, you're having to deal with pollution, you're having to deal with eating, surviving. And it's sort of just this sort of isolated journey through the life of a turtle. Mm-hmm. And I always thought that would be kind of a cool idea. But it was always one of those things where I always wanted it to be pretty realistic, require like really good animation. And then obviously dealing with water, being in water the whole time is a pain in the ass to deal with as well from a development standpoint. So I never really like got off the ground, but I was like talking about it. Who knows, maybe someday I'll come back to it. But if you're coming on board to work on something like that, where do you start in terms of like, we've hired a team, we have let's say we're independent. Let's say we have like 40-person team or something like that. Where are we starting with this project? How are we kicking off sort of the pre-production process?
Yeah, I like to start with risks. So let's go through and identify what I like to call them rakes. Like, hey, what are the different rakes that we could step on? And then once we figure those out, let's develop some mitigation strategies before we ever start typing up any code or anything like that. Like, hey, we could, because if you're saying realistic art style, that has its own challenges. Like, how do we avoid uncanny valley? How do we make sure we get specularity and ray tracing, all these other things to work correctly and to still maintain performance? Mm-hmm. So there's some risks there. Character morphing would be a risk, right? How do we accomplish that? How do we make sure that we can get the growth and development and the life cycle of a turtle where things sort of stretch naturally over time in a way that isn't obvious to the player? Once we've got an idea of like, hey, these are our huge risks, then let's start developing tech demos and prototypes and different things that address those directly. And once you've got all the big scary stuff out of the way, a lot of the rest of it should be really straightforward, and then it just comes down to the team executing.
Yeah.
Now you can't always do that because sometimes you have different obligations and you need to have a certain level at a certain degree of polish and development that you send to the publisher so that you can get your second round of funding or additional time or some kind of thing. But yeah, that's where I tend to like to start is looking at those things, and then developing swim lanes, roadmaps, figuring out when we expect stuff to happen. But I like to leave a good 2 months in pre-production if I can. Depends on the timeline, right? But just time for the team to really poke around at the edges of this design and try to find holes in the design and try to make sure that we get on the other side of any sort of major technical risk that would prevent us from being able to execute.
So when you see these tech demos and prototypes, based on the results, right, do your risks change? Like, let's say we thought about this one risk in terms of performance, but something else that happened in the demo or the prototype is causing other performance issues we didn't anticipate. What would that do?
Yeah, I mean, the design, nothing is set and forget, right? It's all maintained and updated. And I think that's why solutions like Confluence are really strong in the industry, is because a lot of people can hop in and collaborate all at once, and you can have sort of living documentation. I think you have to go through and update stuff as you go. I've worked on projects where something happens in the world because some game released and has this new trend that that's the new hotness. We have to include that in some way. Or there was some sort of disaster that happened in this environment, and we need to be conscious of that in how we represent this character so that we aren't inadvertently making commentary on it or making things worse or alienating people or something like that. So there's, you're always going to have things that adjust your plans and your schedule and your strategy. You have to make your systems for tracking how you move forward as nimble and as adaptable as possible.
Yeah, I think especially when you're talking about we've got this prototype that we're feeling good about, but then we actually start to work on the game, then it's how does that change? Figuring out also when we want to hit deadlines is also something that can become kind of scary, especially if things aren't going as fast as you thought, or you're not finding the fun as fast as you thought. Then it's okay, well, how does that change when we're expecting to deliver this part of the game, and how does that affect everything else that comes after?
Yeah, totally. The one thing that I like about your design is that it doesn't involve a licensed IP, so we're free to do
anything you want. Yeah. You don't have to really worry about any clearances or really any legal issues, as far as I know. And I think one of the challenges about it, a game like this also is pacing, right? Because the ocean is a vast place, and where a turtle can go. I think that's one of the things that's always kind of been scary about this idea to me, is sort of developing how pacing works. Is the game open world, or are we kind of keeping ourselves, or do we have an illusion that we can go in an open world, but not really? How do you keep something like this fun and engaging?
Yeah.
What would be your kind of thought process if you were working with someone on this game who is kind of creative lead or whatever, and being all right, so how are we finding the fun here from just a pacing standpoint?
Yeah, I would look at other games that are similar. So Abzu immediately comes to mind, and how they sort of did their pacing. I would want to look at what's the story we want to tell. How can we drop beats for that story throughout when we have what would otherwise be a dull. I mean, this doesn't sound like it would have much combat, or not at least traditional combat. But if we got some sort of moment like that, if we're in a moment that lacks tension, how can we deliver narrative either through the environment or through turtle visions or something, right? Figuring out those sorts of things, I think, would be essential to making sure that there's still a sense of forward momentum, pun intended, allowing that to ebb and flow.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I really appreciated about Journey was, you see the mountain immediately. Mm-hmm. That's where you need to go. But how you get there and what you do on the way, the pace you go at, is kind of up to you to a degree, unless you get into sort of a conflict area. Because that would be one of the things I would be really interested in also is being able to explore, being able to kind of enjoy this sort of movement, really making the movement feel really good. But also then once you kind of figure that out, then it's all right, now we're kind of getting into more of the conflict of the game. What's happening? How are you surviving? How are you avoiding being killed, et cetera?
I don't know. There's a variety of games where flight is the main method of traversal. Like there's a handful of games where you turn into like an owl or an eagle or something like that. I think because it's still that sort of similar. You have a lot of freedom in your directionality of movement, right? And you could sort of look at what they've done successfully, what you don't like about those systems that you have the skill set on the team to improve upon. Yeah, I think it's there's going to be a certain degree of competitive analysis there just to figure out what's been done before, what's worked well, so that you can sort of develop solutions. Traversal, I think, would be, if you can make just swimming around really fun, that alone could make for a great experience.
Yeah, that's a huge win for sure if you can make that work. What about from the technical and art side of things? Really making the water seem realistic, making tons of different fish, coral, things like that. What kind of process goes into that? Would that be something where you'd say like we want to research places in the world, or also do some competitive analysis there?
Yeah, I think there's some opportunities to do some competitive analysis there. The first thing that comes to mind is fluid dynamics and getting good simulations for that at scale so that you can figure out jet streams and things like that, so that those could be gaming mechanics for like fast transit between locations where you can hop into this sort of jet stream and get a speed boost and be able to travel further. If you're going open world or not, it works both ways, right? There would be a lot of considerations around draw distance for me. Because if you're in an open ocean environment, like how do you make sure that you're creating an experience that feels good in terms of not having too much pop in, having things properly fade in. I would want to do a little bit of research into how turtles actually see, and is there a fun thing that we can do with that from a game design standpoint? Because that might affect depth of field and draw distance and
or even other senses too.
Yeah. I think it would be worth exploring, because in this sort of type of game, you're looking at like dealing with sharks and different types of predators, and so diving into how you manage detection radiuses and what that looks like, and do you want to have ocean current be a factor that influences that? There's a lot to figure out actually from an audio standpoint. There's a handful of folks that have done some great work in underwater environments. Tom Todia worked on some game where I think it's called Maneater. You play as a shark and you hunt divers who are like looking for buried treasure, or maybe you can play as either the shark or the diver. I don't know. There's some balance there, but there's a lot to like figure out to make all of that sound right, because it's very much the sort of thing where it doesn't matter how it sounds in the real world. It matters if that experience that you're hearing aligns with your expectation.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's just how sound works underwater.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a huge thing. And then I guess, once you get into sort of production on it and you sort of figure out, like, I never really imagined it being a super long game, probably like 5 or 6 hours, honestly. Cause like how can you keep that interesting? Right. I think at least that's good news there for anyone who would work on it. It wouldn't be really long. I'd rather have a shorter, really good experience than a longer kind of bloated experience. Mm-hmm. Especially for something where it is kind of a simple idea, where there probably wouldn't be a ton of mechanics, where it is kind of like a little more avant-garde kind of style game.
That is another challenge of pacing, like, because you do want to figure out, okay, if this is our investment, this needs to be our price point, because we think we're going to sell this many copies, and figuring out those kinds of things on an indie scale can be a bit of a challenge, because if you set your price point at a certain level, people won't buy it, or people will buy it, but there's always an expectation that, like, if I buy a $20 game versus a $60 game, about how much of an experience I'm going to get,
right?
Which I do find to be a false dichotomy, but that's sort of the reality of a fair number of players out there, right? So it is something that needs to be considered.
That is definitely something to keep in mind. I think that's also something that people who make not all people, but there's some people who make indie games that don't really take the time to be like, all right, these are direct comparisons to our game. These are the sales results. This is what we think we can do, because there's a market for this. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's one of the ways you can really figure out, should you make this game, mm-hmm. is starting at that point.
Yeah. And I think, the thing you're talking about, there's definitely a market for it. There's, mm-hmm. I can think of a handful of indie examples. Now, I can't think of any that are photoreal. I think there is a cost associated with that has lent itself towards indie games being more stylized. I do think there's an additional freedom for artists that come when you approach a stylized sort of look and feel as far as like the art direction for the game. It does make things more expensive, more intricate in terms of how you approach things.
Yeah. And it's one of those things too, where it's like if someone could come up with an idea for an art style that wasn't too like cartoony, but or it didn't have to be too realistic either, but could make things a lot easier to develop, where I could be like, yeah, that makes sense. Like also, especially if that saves us money and it still can deliver on the experience I'd want, then, it would be one of those things where I'd be like, yeah, all right, yeah, let's see it and see if that would work.
Yeah. I imagine there's some opportunities there too, to get some funding from like, if you make the focus of the game, Ocean Conservancy, there's a number of nonprofits that I would think would want to throw some money behind it so that you're not entirely beholden to the direction of a publisher and stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely. So when you start getting into full-blown production at this point, what are things that you are monitoring? What are, potentially like, what warning signs are you looking for when you're working on something? Or are you kind of like just sort of even keeled? Like I'm always like, that's sort of one of my things is I'm always being like, I'm looking for things that could possibly be going wrong, as opposed to, I'm still acknowledging the things that are going right, but I'm also really trying to key in on those things that could go wrong or are going wrong so I can fix those as fast as I can.
Yeah, I like to keep an open perspective, if that makes sense. So I'm sort of looking at everything and deciding how I should evaluate it. I think the most important thing I'm paying attention to is workload, right? Like looking at how much people have on their plate. Am I overloading people in a way that is setting them up for failure? Or am I loading them up to a degree that is a challenge and allows them an opportunity to grow? And is that challenge appropriate for where they're at in their career and in their professional development? I try to, as often as I can, make sure that the folks on my team have opportunities for growth. And so there's a lot of discussions, when you're going to plan for the next sprint or milestone or however you're dividing up your schedule, talking through these are the things that need to happen. That leaves us this much room for things that we want to happen. Of the things that we need to have happening, like, do I have any volunteers for these things, right? Like, is there something that somebody really wants to take on? And then, okay, we have this other stuff, like, we've got about this much extra room. It seems like you individuals have some additional capacity. Is there anything you want to take on? Or do you just want to pull off the top of the stack and like, okay, well, this is what's going to need to happen next milestone? Giving that sort of agency and trying to make sure that I'm reinforcing that, I think, is important. The other thing I really try to pay attention to is how much time people are putting in. And that's not to say that like you have to put in 40 hours of work or else, right? Like I just want to make sure that people are not crunching because I've planned poorly or because they want to do that to themselves. Because there are some people who are, they feel the need to take on a lot and do a lot. And I try to make sure that folks aren't burning themselves out.
Yeah.
As far as data that I pay attention to, though, estimates versus actuals. Are we estimating things correctly? Like after a few milestones, you can get an idea of like, what, we didn't do good estimates. We need to go back and re-estimate the whole backlog. And hopefully we're better this time. And then the other thing is scope versus capacity. So do I have more work in the backlog than I have team to deliver it?
I think that's such an important thing, especially at those first few milestones, being able to look at it and say, okay, are we really delivering? Are we not? And if we're not, we need to just stop and figure it out and really think about what do we need to do to make these estimates and then the actuals. I like how you put that, estimates versus actuals. What do you think about internal play testing versus external play testing? I always feel like internal play testing needs to happen a ton. When should external play testing start becoming a factor?
Well, there's different types of external play testing, right? So there's the friends and family, especially on the indie scale, there's friends and family, right? But you have sort of professional play testing where you are working with maybe other developers, other people who can put on quote unquote dev goggles. You've got public play tests, you've got closed betas, you have working with research groups and having them do playtesting where they're employing a bit of biometrics and data science and are able to give you some very explicit insights that you maybe can't get otherwise. So I think there is certainly a timeliness. I think if you're going to go the route of using human factors engineers and user experience researchers and those sorts of disciplines, if you want to employ those for external playtesting, it needs to be, you need to go in with a certain thing that you have uncertainty around, right? So you need to say, you know what, we're very confident on our art direction. We're very confident on this. If we get feedback, great. The thing we don't know about is traversal. We want to know that this turtle is fun when you're swimming around, right? And so as soon as you have the thing that you're uncertain of stood up and you're getting mixed results in internal playtesting, that's when I think it's worth going that route. When you have more of an alpha build and you can represent the whole of the experience, I think that's when it's good to sort of get into your external playtest with people who can wear dev goggles, where they can understand sort of the direction things are headed in and the kinds of decisions that have been made that have yet to really be fully fleshed out, so that they can sort of comment and say, like, it looks like you're going in this direction. If you are, great. If you're not, do this thing. Or it looks like you're going in this direction. I think that's probably a misstep. I think I would advise maybe doing this instead. There's a certain amount of sticking to your guns when you get certain feedback and understanding that, thank you for your feedback, but that's not the game we're making. Or
Right.
But also being humble enough to acknowledge where people have given you really valuable insight that it is an incredible opportunity to improve in that capacity of the game. So the friends and family stuff, and when you get into like public external playtesting, that's really you have a polished experience that people can go in on. Like, I think Elden Ring, when they did their server playtest, where it was really about just uploading, getting a lot of people on the servers at the same time so that they could sort of stress test how multiplayer might work, making sure people could connect easily, because that's been a weak point for them in past games. I think they did a really good job of focusing in on, we've really fleshed out Limgrave. We've really, got a good direction on the art here. There's not a lot of buggy things in the design in this area. We are confident in how this looks and how this plays, and it does represent a larger sort of game loop throughout the game, and we can get insightful information on how players like to approach different things, how they like to engage with each other in combat, the way that they explore, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I love that idea about having a goal when you're coming to getting external feedback. I think there's also value in just saying play the game and see what happens, but I think having sort of a goal and thinking about, all right, we really need to look for this and look for feedback on this, or like you said, what From Software did with Elden Ring. I mean, I think it's kind of simple, right, to think about, but a lot of people don't do that.
Yeah, and you don't even need to necessarily tell your playtesters this is what we're looking for.
No,
I would actually
but you should know internally.
Yeah,
you should know internally. I think one of the biggest mistakes I made, especially at school, was, all right, this is our game. This is how it works. This is what you should be looking for. And then it's like, well, they're just here to play the game, man. If you're trying to do that, then it's like, well, you're trying to compensate for shitty design, or you're not confident in your design. Maybe it's not shitty, but that's something I hope people learn really fast or never do. Somebody was doing that to me at GDC earlier this year, and I was like, this is really not helping. I think explain every little thing to me.
I think there could be a time and a place for it. Especially when you're doing sort of more of the human factors focused research, where you've got, at the end of this playtest, we're going to ask you these sorts of questions. So please consider those things throughout, right? Like there's
right.
There are ways to approach that, but I do think if you're going in and telling people what they're supposed to experience, you're going to get some pretty biased results in your data.
Yeah, no, totally. And then they're not going to find the fun themselves. And then anything where they could have found it won't feel like that to them. They won't enjoy it as much.
Mm-hmm.
So when do you start knowing that we're in a position maybe where we can start saying we're close to being finished?
I have never actually felt that. I have known we as a team have something great that we need to bring up to quality, but the quality bar is a moving target. because of the other games that come out, and publisher expectations can change, and so it's interesting from that point. It's usually like the adage that I like to say is no game ships 100% finished. If you were to go back and ask the team, like, what would you have done to, if you had like another 6 months, what would you have done on the project? They'll give you a whole list of all these things they would have liked to do. And then you're like, okay, what about a year? That list is just going to grow, right? Like there's always more you could do to take a project further. You sort of have to figure out when done enough is, right? Like we're comfortable with this shipping at this quality, but this other thing needs to be at a higher quality. Yeah, so figuring out what sort of those targets are and aiming for those, I think, is really all you can do, and understanding that you've only got so much time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, thanks for participating in that hypothetical. That was cool.
Sure. Yeah.
I guess sort of close us out. The producing discipline is not something that's really as sought after seemingly by a lot of students or by people trying to get their foot in the door. If someone is out there looking to get into production, what advice would you give them in terms of where maybe the positions they should look for, and then who, once they get in the door, who should they start? Maybe a shadowing, things like that. Just any advice that you have for anyone who wants to get into the discipline.
Yeah, I would say production is a little bit unique in that we sort of take people from any industry. So if you're interested in being a game producer, getting any experience as a project manager is valuable. Whether that's being a business analyst at some banking software company, or being a project coordinator at a construction company, like any sort of project management experience you can accrue is going to be valuable, because at the end of the day, right, like the same principles apply, like on time, under budget, good team morale, good team cohesion, efficiency, like all those kinds of things like are going to apply across the whole gamut of different types of project management. I sort of think of things in terms of, rather than hard and soft skills, you have technical, conceptual, and human skills. You're going to need to develop some level of like emotional intelligence so that you're good at the human skills. You're going to need to develop self-awareness and learn how to regulate your own emotions so that you can, be the calm in the storm, as it were. And like you're going to have to develop your human skills no matter what, if you want to advance as a producer, as a project manager, regardless of industry. You're going to need to develop technical skills around project management, regardless of industry, if you want to be in production, right? So focusing on those and building up those skills and that knowledge base, I think, is good. The conceptual skills, the like sort of understanding how design influences production decisions, understanding how you're going to choose to establish your processes, and what sort of tools you have for intervention, like the sort of higher level stuff like that'll come with time in the discipline. Those strong conceptual skills are really important at like senior producer and above. If you're an associate, like that doesn't need to be on your radar at all. It's I think it's good to be aware of that is an opportunity for you to grow in that area, but I don't think that you need to be too concerned with not actively developing those skills as you're going along. And I've seen people come from construction, from oil, from banking, from simulation software, like the whole range of different types of project managers I've worked with as fellow producers.
Yeah, well, cool. Well, Aaron, thanks a lot for coming on the show today, and definitely appreciate your insight. And anything you want to plug? We always like to give people an opportunity to plug things at the end. If you want to do so, feel free.
Sure. Dragon Age Dreadwolf. Keep an eye out on the announcements and all that. I don't have a release date that I can communicate at this time, but keep an eye out. We are working on it. We did hit alpha, so the game will be coming at some point. And the team's working really hard, and I can't wait for players to get their hands on it. It's going to be a great experience.
Awesome. Yeah, I think Everyone is Dragon Age fans looking forward to that one big time. So best of luck on finishing development on that, and look forward to playing it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, that's going to wrap up our show for this week. We want to thank Aaron again for being our guest. To find out more about Mudstack, head over to mudstack.com, where you can follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and join our community on Discord. And of course, we want to thank you for listening. We'll see you next time on Clear as Mud.